serious people will always read. I think like there's a lot of people that read as little as they can, and they will probably get the results they deserve. Acknowledging that reading is not easy for everybody, and there's dyslexic people, that some people are, better listeners than readers. But I think readers are, the returns to reading are quite high, in that they train your concentration and critical thinking in ways that just listening to audiobooks don't. I'm a fan of audiobooks. I listen to fiction on Audible, or I just get reps of material that I've already read and reminders. But your attention does not power an audiobook in the way that it powers a real book. And I think that's an important part of engaging with the material and understanding it. If you could give people one habit that would make them, one of a handful of habits that would make them significantly more likely to rise in life. And I learned this from Charlie Munger relatively young, like just read, just keep reading.
Win all in, play my cards right. Up the ante, won blackjack all night. Roll the dice, let it ride. Water the odds, I got snake eyes.
This podcast exists because of the team at CAS-CM. CAS-CM is a B2B content production company helping organizations create and share their stories. We aim to create space where businesses can build assets and drive revenue through writing and talking. Content creation should be enjoyable and accessible. At CAS-CM, we love helping make that happen. Learn more at cascm.com.
Well, man, I appreciate you spending time. You're on a lot of podcasts, right? Like, which is really cool. I always talk to people and like, it's like I've already talked to you. I haven't, like maybe in my own mind. Maybe that's weird. Maybe it's not. But it makes it a lot easier because like I've seen your headset before. I've seen you communicate. I've seen that room behind you, right? It's more comfortable to have that type of conversation. I've talked to business owners where they'll create content. They might not have this huge audience, but then they show up. Let's say it's a new hire and they have a headhunter that's introduced them to this person. And that they feel so much more comfortable because they've already seen them talk, their thoughts, how they communicate. So someone shows up to that. So when we're, you're spending a lot of time recording podcasts, you have your own podcast that you do a little bit, and you also you're appearing on podcasts. Like, why are you doing all this podcasting?
A lot of different reasons. I think you point out a few good ones, which is like you can really have some amazing conversations. Like just the first order of just like, I get an hour to get to know you. That's awesome on its own.
Right.
The fact that we're going to record that hour and for zero marginal cost for, 10 years, maybe 100 years, like anybody who wants to is going to get to listen to that. Like, I feel like we're making digital clones right now, and recording and publishing stuff is just, it's such a miracle that I think it's still kind of underrated. And I think it's a really I think it's called like the parasocial relationship, that feeling where you're like, spending time with somebody digitally. I enjoy it. Like, there's times when you're like listening to people talk and you want to start like yelling into the mic and you're like, no, I have so much to add to this conversation. Like, I want to meet you guys. I want to talk. That's literally why my podcast is called Smart Friends. Like, I just have casual conversations with people that I'm learning stuff from, and I get to know people and bring them in because I listen to them on other podcasts and just kind of build this community, build this world. I think it's super fun.
Yeah. It's a little bit of, I remember it early on, some years ago before I started the business, I was in a consumption phase, right? I'd be consuming a lot of content. And I was thinking about like, well, how do you get into the production side of it? How do you contribute to the conversation? And when you start doing that, it's, I don't know, you feel more a part of it, right? And I think, like you said, it leads to connection. So that parasocial relationships, like you can go listen to a Joe Rogan show. And if you listen to every episode, it's 2 to 3 hours long. You do feel like Joe's like, there's people out there like, that's my guy, like that's my friend, but like you've never actually spoken to the guy before. So that can get a little bit, it could go off that way. But now if you start participating in it and having conversations, the next thing you know, Scribe Media, Eric's reaching, his team's reaching out. You're like, wow, this is a big difference maker to actually having it.
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot. I mean, I sort of looked forward to participating in the conversation, like starting a podcast and stuff like that. But I think, there's a lot of people that are at our level or way above it in their career and in their success that just don't have the appetite for it. And I think that's totally cool and okay too, right? Like there's plenty of downsides to, being public in any meaningful way, let alone, higher levels of fame than we're at. And so I totally respect people that are just like, no, I just consume. And to your point about Joe Rogan, I agree. Like there's people that spend more time with Joe Rogan than they do with anybody else in their life.
Oh yeah.
And choosing who you want to have that kind of relationship with and who you want to spend that much time with. You choose your heroes and then they sort of form you, or you choose your friends and then they form you. And we are so lucky to live in an age where we can choose almost anybody in the world to be our hero and surround ourselves with, the greatest mathematicians of all time or the greatest athletes of all time, especially with AI. Like, there's a lot of Kobe content out there, but like if you want to spend 5,000 hours with Kobe in your ear, I think the tools for that are here. They're somewhere, if not everywhere already. And you can really shape yourself into, who you want to be by choosing those voices.
Yeah. And the production side could go in a lot of different areas. I mean, you could have an audio podcast for yourself or you're just talking into your phone on a walk, right? That becomes your audio journal or you're writing it out, right? So, and I definitely don't mean it to be, you have to go out there and produce a podcast or write a blog or do those types of things. And what you're getting at is obviously what you have become an expert in is leverage, right? And you've talked about it in your book, Almanac of Naval Ravikant. And I remember, I guess it would have been during COVID, the How to Get Rich tweet storm that he had. And I remember consuming that. Like you see the tweets and then you have the audio version of it. And it was like in bits and bits and bits. And then he took it and he created it to be this long 3-hour podcast. And I remember like falling asleep to it. I remember going back to it. And then I'm sitting around and I can't remember what it was. I probably saw it on social media, probably on Twitter at the time, now X, obviously. And there's this book out. And I'm like, wait, so we just took this whole thing. There's a guy out there that took this whole thing and made it into a book. So now I have the written version of it. I have the audible version of it. And then I could go back to all these different avenues to where, again, and I'll go back to the point that you were making before, you're getting into leverage and you become, I don't know, if a master, you're continuing to work at it, like just like Naval's continuing to work at it, as he talks about. Like, where did that hit you? And I know you've talked about another podcast, but like real quick, like where did you not connect with Naval, but his thoughts?
I mean, I think I first heard about Naval when I was maybe 18 or 19. I was just like a kid in Michigan, and somebody who had like built and sold a bunch of startups happened to be in town. I was giving a talk, and we were sort of got to know each other, and I was asking him about like how to get to San Francisco and how to get involved in the startup world. And he's like, just read everything Paul Graham has ever written and read everything Naval has ever written, and you'll be like well on your way to understanding the startup world. And I was like, yes, sir.
It works. Yeah.
So I got both of those blogs. I printed them all out. I put them in binders, and I got to work and read through all of that. And so that was my introduction to Naval. But I followed his whole career really through building AngelList and doing a lot of investments, and then sort of transitioning into this more philosophical bent about happiness. And I just, learned so much from him over the years. And I think, to your point, leverage was like really so important, but buried in that kind of tweet storm. And it's one of the accountability. You can sort of, there's a lot of implications to it, but you can sort of define it in a page or two, a section of that book. Leverage is deserving of like at least a book on its own, maybe more. Just as a concept, it's very deep. And so I did a lot of like thinking and writing and exploring around that after writing the book, because there's so much to it. And it is a defining piece of sort of the era that we're in.
Yes. Well, we talked about the podcasting before, sometimes you question it, like maybe it's a book, like you're writing the book. You're like, well, what am I doing? Right? This is taking a lot of time. It's a lot of effort. It's a lot of energy, whatever those things. I can't do these other things as a result of doing these things. And then you think about media. And when I hear that, it was like, keep going down that path. That I would think back. I remember we had the CEO of a company in here, and like, I think we had an intern, and he reached out and found this company came in, a guy comes, it's like 2:00 on a Tuesday. I'm like, we're talking, and I'm thinking like, wait, this guy came to see us, and the only reason he's here is because we have a podcast. So the leverage of the podcast brought this person here, and we're looking to talk to CEOs, like let's just say in the Charlotte area at the time. That leverage was just like, it's a very basic version of it. Even the intern, he's like, man, I get it. He's like, because that microphone is in front of him and we could broadcast him, that was a form of leverage. And then hearing Naval talk about it, and then your book talk about it, like that just became that next layer of like, wow, just right. We keep going with this thing. Because it's hard when you're selling a product or a service, it's very easy to see that return. When you're doing it in media, sometimes you don't see it, but actually behind it is this exponential growth, this potential, maybe this even black swan event that's down the road. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's totally right. The other piece of it is that it doesn't take a huge audience to have a huge impact like on your life, right? I talk about this with authors all the time. Most of the numbers that you see publicly, people talk about are like, oh, so this book has sold 1 million copies. This book's sold 5 million copies. And so you have in your head that like, if it's not 1 million copies, it's not going to be a success. It's not going to be meaningful. And when you actually dig into the numbers, like that's a fraction of a percent, like literally 0.00, maybe another 0.01 books that get that big. Most books sell only a few thousand copies if they're lucky. Like 10,000 starts to become like a really big success especially for a self-published book. And the same thing is true in podcasting, right? Like I think a lot of people get demoralized if they're only getting 1,000 downloads an episode or a few hundred, views. And I'm like, you know how sweaty you'd be if you walked into a room of 1,000 people like there to
Yeah.
watch you talk for an hour? Like
Yeah.
that'd be the biggest deal of the year because it's sort of abstracted and you don't see those people watching you. The numbers you get numb to them, and small numbers don't feel as good. But that's part of my, back to your first question, like part of why I go on so many podcasts. Like I think I'm honored by the invitation to be here and the kind of inherent compliment that you're willing to introduce me to all of your hard-won, high-trust relationships. Like that's really meaningful. And if people are willing to spend an hour listening to you and I talk and get to know us and, join a newsletter, like that's an incredible opportunity. And even if it's only 10 people that actually like join my newsletter or whatever, that is a really important piece. And that all of those opportunities add up over time.
Why would someone, and I know why, but like I want to hear your perspective on this. Like they look at ROI. I want to start a podcast. I want to go on a podcast. I want to write a book. Or I don't, and I'm being convinced to, what's the return on investment of doing that, right? Like, because you could sit here on this podcast like, well, I need to get this, and this out of this thing, right? And you're clearly, if you're writing a book, like you said before, there's a fraction of the people, like a 1% sells 99% of the books or whatever those numbers are. Like going into it thinking you're going to make money off of that book is probably not the best way to go about it, right? If that happens, that's amazing. I don't know what your perspective was when you wrote the Almanac of Naval Ravikant, right? But
yep.
The ROI question constantly comes up, especially in this new age of media and long form content and snippets and all this kind of stuff. A lot of time and effort. Anyway, like you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, there's, again, a lot of reasons. I think I always try to have a very long view, like longest view in the room, and just look at all of these as like very long-term compounding games. The other is a very broad ROI, right? I have this conversation with authors all the time who are like, I tell them how much it's going to cost to publish a book at a really high level or to have help writing a book. And they're like, they start doing the math on the royalties and the book sales and discounting the cash. And I'm like, this is the wrong way to think about it. Like you are going to arrive at a no if all you look at is like the royalty return on your book on like a risk adjusted basis. The right way to look at it is like, what is the full life ROI over a 5 or 10 year period? And when you do that, you see like most of the returns from my book, like I've got a lot of royalties, but a lot of them have been getting invited to conferences or to speak at conferences, like a free ticket to a $10,000 a seat conference, let alone being put on the stage at that. What's that worth? Like if you were to put hard value on it, you might have to pay 50 grand to like get on a stage at a conference like that, then let alone what's the business, the opportunities, the friendships, the connections that are going to come out of that, and what's the return of all of those, a rise of your credibility. So the way I look at like a book, a podcast, anything like this is it's a multiplier effect on everything else you ever do. And when you look at people's careers, a lot of time there's the perception that somebody, kicks ass for 70 years and then writes a book in 6 months and then dies. And like, that's not how it works.
Yeah.
Like most people, when you look at them, they wrote a book or had some hit, like public big jump in their credibility after 5 or 10 years when they did a public exhibition of their talent and their experience and their expertise. And they wrote a book and it became this inflection point for becoming the person who owns this category and is known as this, becomes a thought leader in this space, or they start getting inbound calls instead of having to make outbound calls for their business if they're, speaker, coach, consultant, stuff like that. So it's a very interesting, you're right, it can be a painful slog to like hit that inflection point.
Yeah.
But it's worth it once you do.
You don't see it, right? I think that's the hard part. I've talked to so many people in the media. It's like, it's just so different today, right? Like you don't have to go on Channel 2 News and get on their morning talk show to like talk about your insurance business, right? Or whatever that might be. There's so many other ways to go about it. But sometimes you're like, I'm talking to nobody. No one's reading my book. Like, but that's the conviction, I guess, that you have. I don't know. And I think that's reading books, listening to other people's podcasts, hearing like a Naval talk about it, and to say, this is what potentially could happen, right? If you just keep going and have belief in what you're doing and you have a good thing to say. And I think you only need a few people out there to like say, yes, this is really good stuff.
Yeah. And that comes down to like, you want to really understand your niche and your audience, your readers, your listeners. If you have collected the right 100 people or the right 1,000 people for your message and you're delivering value to them, that can be incredibly powerful, incredibly useful, and build a really big business off of that. If you're just trying to be like just build a creator business and just be in the business of having a big audience. Like, you've got to contort yourself in some different ways to try to build like a big number so that you get enough. Like, the economics on your individual listener just on your YouTube ads or whatever aren't great. So then you do need to actually chase numbers, and that's a whole different game.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, the vanity metrics, I see it. And I think you could probably Scribe Media. I heard you talk about this on the James Altucher show, right? It's where you talked about they had an office, right? And they like really scaled up their office location. That is sometimes for some, and I know people like this, right? That's a vanity metric, right? How many follows do you have? How many likes? How many? I had this question when I started my business, it's 13 years ago. Like, how many employees do you have? How big is your office space? Like, what I just understand. It was almost like I just came from the gym. It's how much do you bench? I'm like, what does it matter? And you talk to enough people, it's like not about how much you bench, right? It's all these different things. But where I worked at a larger company, and the mid-level management or the top management would always, how many people report to them? And these are getting into the vanity metrics of, you get lost. How many followers on YouTube? How many views do you have? Like you said, it's a different animal altogether. But I think we live in a society where like those numbers mean something to a lot of people. But at the end of the day, I remember I talked to a fitness person and like they wanted millions of views. And I'm like, well, how many clients do you need? Because that's what they ultimately wanted. They're like, if I had 30 clients that looked like this, I would be amazed. I'm like, then why are you going after 1 million? Right? Like, those numbers don't make sense.
Yeah. If you're targeting a small number of very focused people, it makes a lot more sense to, go after them very specifically. Like, we have authors who write books that are so astonishingly niche, you'd be shocked that anyone ever wrote it. Or like, I have a blog post, like the economy is mind-bogglingly vast. It's just so big and it's so fractal. And there's so many people who build incredible livings doing things that are so vanishingly like tiny as a part of the economy, but they're so niche that nobody else even thinks about it or ever bothers. And so the more you can, niche that down and speak to people that are like exactly your group. I saw a guy the other day. It's like he's a ghostwriter for CROs in North America on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Like, that's all he does.
That's it.
Very specific.
Yeah.
There's a book we publish about retiring financial planning firms, like small individual firms for people who are like in their 60s who are retiring. And like, his thing is, here's how to transition, here's who to sell your business to, here's how to sell it, here's the state that it needs to be in order to sell it, here's what you can expect the transition to be like. And like, he's probably never going to sell more than 5,000 copies of that book over 10 years. But maybe 50 of those people who buy the book are going to pick up the phone and call him and try to sell him their business.
Yeah.
And he's going to make an incredible living doing that.
Yeah. If you think about like, if you talk to a certain type of person, like a startup in Silicon Valley and someone like yourself, like Naval is like an obvious name that you're going to hear. I talk to numerous people. If I'll bring up their name, like, I have no idea who that is. And I think Naval would understand that too. Like, not everybody knows like Joe Rogan maybe becomes a household name. There's very few of those names, but like they've developed, like to your point, that niche and that audience, and then they get into that moment and it scales very differently for different people. Yeah.
The way I think about it, at least, like, I think being a household name would be a fucking nightmare.
Yeah.
Even like, Tim Ferriss is like famous, but not everybody knows him. Like Joe Rogan, Oprah are very like, everybody knows him. That sounds absolutely terrible. I think you want to be famous in like one room. Like, imagine the conference of your industry. You want to be like known and respected and have people excited to see you in that particular room of, 1,000 people. And aside from that, anonymity is bliss.
Yeah. Famous with your household, right? With your family, with your spouse, your kids, that kind of stuff, like where they know who you are.
Yeah. Yeah. Welcomed in your community with the actual loved ones in your life, not, impressing internet strangers.
Yeah, exactly. Because you think like they're not real people. And some of them really aren't real people, right? Like, as we know now, like bots and AI, like you're talking about what they said. I'm like, who is they? Because they don't exist. Yeah. And that's wild.
or they're like, even worse, they are people who are deeply unwell.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, you go viral enough times to like read replies and you're like, if a real person made that comment to you, you'd be like, oh man, I'm so sorry. Like, let's have a conversation about that. And then you go look at the person's feed and you're like, oh, you're a professional hater. You tweet something negative every 2 minutes for the last 12 hours. Like, my responsibility to cure you is, this is not a conversation that we're going to have.
I was talking to Gordon Hayward, NBA player, right? He comes on, he's talking about this stuff and he heard it all, right? Like,
I'm sure.
He played in the league for 14 years and it's wild. Even when we posted clips of his podcast, They're like, bro couldn't even spell the NBA. This guy, he's like allergic to play. And you're just like, my guy played in the NBA for 14 years, all-star, like just did amazing things, played top team, scored 20 something points in the league, like just wild stuff. And people just want to hate any success that we see. It's like, they just wanted to bring it down. So I don't know what you saw when your book started getting out there and more people are talking about it. Because obviously you can have naysayers. Like, it's not going to be like, oh my God, he's the greatest person of all time. Like, right? You're not Gandhi here. But what happened for you when like that fame or the sales started happening?
It's a broadening experience in kind of the same way that like travel is, or like reading a good book of a perspective that you haven't had before. It's a new experience. It teaches you something new. And, there's a very interesting, like, you build up new calluses in some ways, but you also you gain a really deep understanding of like the impersonality of it. And like eventually you come to just find it really kind of funny. At least like that's my view. It's just kind of rolls off the back and you're like, you can pity people who kind of spend that much time in that headspace. You can sort of try to understand, the psychology of it, of like the insecure really loathe the mirror. And there's a lot of that. And learning to separate like thoughtful critique from just hating.
Yeah.
And there's some people are really good at this, of appreciating that like haters are fans too.
Yep.
They just express themselves negatively.
Yeah. It's good.
And like there's so much of reality TV, or even of the personalities that are big on social right now are actually like negative triggers. Like I think Logan Paul's a good example of this. I think he like very deliberately makes himself hated and chooses to do that because he knows that drives the conversation and that keeps him in the spotlight and that's how he gets paid. And I don't love that as a strategy. I don't aspire to it. I don't think it's like great for society, but there's no denying that like our psychology is manipulatable in that way.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, you turn on ESPN, right? And you talk about a sports team and you could trigger it. I'm like, they don't believe what they're saying. But look around, it's advertisements, it's Hyundai commercials, it's this food ad, it's a Chipotle, and they need to sell advertising on the back of it. So we need clicks. So we're going to say something bad about your team and you're going to get outraged. And then we're going to get more people to come watch and go to our website.
Yeah, it's a boxing promotion. It's the fighters hating each other. It's the gossip. It's, Stephen A. Smith, like just screaming on TV. The headlines being more negative than the articles. Like, I think it's all quite unfortunate. And I wish we would all sort of learn to rise above it and, vote with our attention by focusing on the more positive people. It's good for our own mental health, but it's also just like a vote for how we want society to communicate with each other.
Yeah. Probably read a lot of Ryan Holiday books or listen to podcasts, or like even like Trust Me, I'm Lying, like that whole thing where he talks about like in that book, it's a perfect example. Like, yeah, we need to sell tickets to this movie. So we're going to go, I think they like did one where they painted a swastika outside the movie theater and it was just all so they get people to show up. Like there was no hate involved. It was just obvious triggering to go like, hey, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, they like staged their own protests and then other people sort of mimicked the protests and then the protests got written about. And you're like, yeah, you just manufactured a controversy.
Hacking culture. Last night because I knew we were going to talk to you, I was reading The Sovereign Child. I had seen your tweet about it. I think it was LinkedIn post, tweet, is one of the other. And so I pick it up and I go to a chapter about screen time for kids. I'm like, wow, this is, first of all, it's like really cool that the author gets posted, that it has a post. You make a post about it. Naval has a post about it. So clearly it's like, oh, there's people who are just like, what does he say to read? I'll just go read that. So like, I can imagine the book, I think it sold 10,000 copies, maybe its first day, which is like a significant achievement, as you mentioned. And
incredible.
That perspective of what he had, where he took a topic that is like the complete opposite. Everyone's been saying no more screen time, get your kids off of their devices. He comes out with a complete opposite perspective on it from a standpoint of like experience with his own family, from the medical side of things, right? And I'm just like, wow, regardless of what you think about it, like what a cool thing to read and understand. And you all are behind that book, right? Like you're Scribe Media. So that experience of what's just taken place as we're recording this over the last few days, now the book's going to continue to sell copies, I'm sure, as this is published and well into for many years. But like your experience with The Sovereign Child, that author, that situation of what's happening right now with that book.
Yeah, Aaron is a great guy. Like this is the parenting application of David Deutsch's ideas.
Yeah.
Like the theory of knowledge. And he's the author of The Fabric of Reality and The Beginning of Infinity. And he's very, very brilliant academic and thinker and philosopher. And Aaron has been learning from him for a long time and enacted these principles sort of in his family with, I think, 4 or 5 kids. And to your point, it's it's radical by conventional standards today. I don't know. I think there's different cultures and different times that would have had different relationships with it. But he's very much like, I think the sort of title of the movement is taking children seriously, and it's just treat them like tiny adults, treat them like guests in your home. Assume that they have a valid reason for wanting to do whatever they're doing, and they're running a lot of series of very extreme and high value experiments about how they want to live their life. And so if they want to eat ice cream for dinner, let them eat ice cream for dinner. And then an hour later, when they feel terrible, like remind them that this is why they feel terrible,
Right.
and that they probably don't want to do it tomorrow. It's just this culture, not necessarily of enforcing everything with rules and authority, but if allowing the children to kind of learn through their own trial and error. You're farther into the book than I am. We publish it, but I did my best to support them, but I am not like super, super close to it yet. But it's already, to your point, there's already some incredible conversations happening around the book on social media.
Yeah. Well, and then to have that book go out, right? Like I said before, Naval says like, hey, this is the book that you need to read. That's going to get copies, right? That's an incredible accomplishment. Was that expected that he was going to say something about that or not at all?
Well, I think Naval and Aaron had already had some, I think Aaron did a fantastic job of sort of building this alliance of people who were aligned with it, and they had had a prior relationship.
Okay.
And Naval has been talking about the ideas of David Deutsch and the theory of knowledge and supporting people who are supporting it for quite some time now. So I was not shocked to see, that sort of endorsement right out of the gate. And somebody posted this is why New York Times hates Twitter, because one tweet from Naval gets more attention and gets more books than being on a New York Times bestseller list. And that's becoming more and more obvious every day. So I think Aaron did an amazing job of sort of building his coalition of supporters and knowing that he had an existing community to sort of launch this book into that would be supportive of the ideas, and that the ideas would then start a conversation that would carry the book into a lot of people's attention.
Yeah, which is hitting on some of his points of media and leverage, right? Like right out of the gate, like what a concept. And learning, right? So he had to learn all these theories and ideas and read the books and listen to the podcasts and all that kind of stuff, and then leverage the current day platforms. I think you had mentioned on some podcasts I heard you on where like the Almanac didn't even show up on the New York Times bestseller list, but yet it outsold all these other books, which is just wild. And I've talked to people who are like, yeah, to get on that platform, it's like, I don't know what you're doing, but you're hacking the system, right? Inevitably.
Yeah, it's a very, pretty sure I've outsold, 99.9% of books that have ever been on the New York Times bestseller list at this point, and never been on the list. But by their own admission, the New York Times got very clear about this after they would sued a few times by authors who were like me, who had sold a ton of copies, but not been on the list. And, they, in court, their case is like, well, it's editorial. Like, we just get to choose what goes on the list. It's us selecting books that we like.
Right.
We are not compelled to respect, the numbers. It's not a dashboard. It's not meant to be. It's just us picking books that we like. And so it inherently becomes very political, and there are some sales numbers that you need to hit to get considered. But a lot of the books that are like quote unquote New York Times bestsellers are, somebody managed to buy 20,000 books and they're sitting in a warehouse and they paid somebody to place a bunch of orders, and there's systems for doing that, and there are authors who do it. And for some people, it's worth it. For some people, it like that credential, even if it's sort of the perception of that credential, even if they know that it's not really like this stamp of approval from the New York Times, but a lot of people still respect it. And so sometimes it helps speakers earn more fees. Sometimes it helps unlock other doors, other opportunities. So I know some people who've done it and not regretted it. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it if you're playing a credibility game, but I never shy away from telling people how that really works.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think we need it, right? We get a lot of people coming to us saying they want to be on the podcast, right? And then they'll list out their credentials, their Forbes thing, their Harvard Business Review or whatever, and then like shocked when they weren't chosen, let's say. And like, well, don't you know I wrote these books, or I did this, or I was featured. Yeah, congratulations, right? Like it's not an adversarial thing, right? It's just like, that's not doing it for me, right? Like when you all reach out and I see this, I'm like, no, I know him, but I know of him, and I know the books that he wrote, and I could see what he's posting online, and I could easily go in there and say, are we chasing vanity metrics over here? Are these even real? Because like, well, they had 40,000 followers. I'm like, yeah, but 2 people like their post on Instagram. So those followers are probably bought or something along those lines. So it's like, I see through that shit like immediately. And you're looking for the right people, not to say just because you were in the Harvard Business Review or just because you're in New York Times doesn't make you a bad person, right? Like it's just, there's more to the story than just the one accolade.
Well, learning, I mean, you clearly got a good eye for it, but learning that skill of how to separate the sort of people who are using third-party credentials versus people who have built their own credential. I've got a couple blog posts about this too, as I was kind of thinking through it, but like, I think it's hilarious that the Forbes 30 under 30 is such a strong predictor of like future fraud,
Yeah, that's why.
right? Because
Yes.
like the people who can like pay or connect or beg, borrow, steal their way onto that list, it's almost by definition a list for people who have not yet accomplished something, but like kind of hope to while they're young. And
Yeah.
so the Forbes 30 under 30 thing and the number of people that end up over their skis in a way that causes financial harm to other people is really, really high. And, you know, we saw there are people in publishing that do this. Like that's their main accolade is like somebody wrote about me in this like piece of press or under this brand, or I won this award. And like all of that is bullshit, frankly. Like you've got to look at unfakeable metrics to your point, like how many people are actually engaging with posts. Like followers can be good, but it can be bad. How many people, not what bestseller list were you on, how many people actually bought the book? How many good reviews are there on the book? Buy the book, how good is the book itself? So it takes an extra layer of diligence to figure out who's really got the sauce. But that's a very important skill to learn in life, to not get duped.
It's hard because you have to take time. You know, you have the LinkedIn pods that people were doing or X. I could see it. I'm like, listen, this guy's making a post and these people are all coming in there saying like some, I don't know, like some average stuff that like, why would you spend the time even saying that unless then you go look at their posts and they're all flip-flopping and just going back and forth and like they're just trying to game the algorithm and, you know, hey, do your thing. And I guess it's probably working in some regards, but
yeah. Like, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that either. Like, it's a pretty tried and true tactic of like, there is algorithmic response in that first like half an hour, and you want signal from other big accounts, and you want to start the conversation, and like those little alliances of people that
for
sort
sure
of came up together on social.
And there's people paying. I think what I'm saying is like, there's a pay to play organization that's there.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing. And I saw someone who's like paying for it. I'm like, why are you doing this? Like, because once you stop, it all falls off and now it doesn't make any sense. So I know you were paying for it. And he was telling me like how this thing would work. And eventually he came to that realization, that individual came to that realization where we are. But, you know, PR, earned media is fascinating. Like I didn't spend a lot of time with it. And then you have a podcast and like constantly getting reached out to. And sometimes it's amazing, right? And you have like, incredible people, PR companies, and they're going to do the right thing. But it's like they reach out to you. They want to be on the podcast or whatever media you have on that side of it. And then they're gone, right? They don't care. They're just trying to like post and ghost type of thing. And they don't want to be a part of anything like that. I'll do this for you and I'll do that for you. And they don't do any of those things. So again, you have to go through that stuff. But in an era of like people want to be on podcasts, they want to be featured in books, they want to be quoted online, like, and you guys are doing it, right? I was actually talking, this is wild. It was Chris Hively. He's a co-founder of MapQuest. And Scribe Media, this is before you had taken it over, we had done some of your authors, right? Or their authors when Tucker Max was there. And incredible, like working with the team, like really good people, really good guests that would come on the podcast, really nice to deal with. Like that was a company I was like, ooh, Scribe Media is reaching out. Very easy to know that they're going to handle this the right way. That day when I was talking to Chris, I don't know if it was that day that it took place, but he's like, I was like, I'm going to reach out to this individual. He's like, they're not there. Like this just happened. And Scribe Media is, I don't know, it's no more, it's bankrupt, it's whatever before you had taken it over. So it's a very interesting time, but it was also to the side of like on my rant that I'm on, not rant, but like on my stream of consciousness of like the PR side of things too. So there's two angles to take this here. Let's first stay on the PR side of stuff, right? Because when I talk to your team, like again, oh yeah, absolutely. And then you have the CEO of the company, the author of the book, right? All of that. Where do you all see it? Because when I talk to your team, like I could clearly tell that you all have a different thought process around it, as opposed to all these other people that are stuck in my email box or my team's email boxes of like, we just want to get on your podcast and then we want to squeeze as much juice out of you as possible and then we're out, right?
Yeah, I think we are thoughtful about it, right? Like we try to take the time we don't just like build a list and blast the list every time we have a new author published. We, take the time to very carefully understand like your show and what your audience is and what they're here for and who's interested. And then we've got a wide variety of different authors. And so not every author is going to suit every podcast. And the bar should be high for getting someone introduced to your audience and spending an hour with them, let alone all the research that you do before they come on. Like you've got to care. And we have some super interesting people that come through that are really, sometimes they're already well known and people are really excited to talk to them. Sometimes they're, the book is the first piece of them really like stepping into that kind of like wisdom sharing, giving back part of their career. And they're incredible people, even though nobody's ever heard of them yet. And that becomes a great opportunity for the right podcasters to kind of be the one to break that person open and like start sharing them with the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's the person that comes on there. Like, if like, go back and stay on the theme of like when you go on Joe Rogan, it's not like, oh, we're just going to talk about the book that you wrote. Like, yeah, we're going to get into that part of it. And maybe there'll be like some nuances inside the book. It's actually like the individual. Let's just have a conversation. What are your perspectives on this? Right. As opposed to pitching your product, right? Pitching your service. It's like, that's a commercial and that's boring. And no one wants to listen to that stuff, right?
Yeah. I've done a few of those podcasts where like I show up and it starts to feel like an infomercial. And I'm like, hey, if that's like what your audience is here to expect, a very like
right.
practical, tactical thing of like, here's what this person can provide you and what you should expect if you work with them. Like, cool, fine. I can roll with that. But like, these kind of conversations end up being more fun because we get into stuff that we've never talked about before.
Yeah. Yeah. And for the listener, they could say, who is Eric Jorgenson, right? Like, what is the Almanac of Naval? Like, they're going to find it, right? The person that wants to find it will find it. And like, they'll discover the blog post that you wrote, and then they'll become a newsletter, right? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, let's stay back on that topic real quick on the Scribe Media thing, because I'm having that conversation, like really good people. And then I reached back out on that Hively podcast that we had done, and this person's email is getting kicked back to me. I'm like, okay, so this was real. Like, they're not there anymore. And then like, where did it go? What's going to happen? I'm like, I trusted this company because I thought they were going to have more guests coming on and we had a good thing going. And then your name pops up, right? So I think you actually had a book going with them at this time. And so you talk about this on other podcasts. We'll put the links to like the Alter Show in there and some other ones. I think people should listen to that. It's like, these are good hour-long conversations that you're having other places where you get really deeper into these topics. But that's a wild time. And I don't know, like we talked about leverage before. Did your book get you to a point, like, was it leverage in a way to get you to show up to the table and say, yeah, Scribe Media is actually a real possibility for you, whether it's from a money standpoint or recognition standpoint? Like,
yeah, I think it's both. I mean, I really like the Steve Jobs, like everything makes sense in the rearview mirror.
Yeah.
Kind of all the like life decisions. And my 22-year-old self would be shocked to find me running a publishing company. But when you see the sort of like my interest in startups, and tweeting became blogging, and blogging became writing a book, and writing a book became, it became a very successful book, both financially and sort of in its reach. And then the way that I had to publish that book because of the nature of the project was like, just very obviously self-publishing was the move. And so I had an incredible experience working with Scribe. And, that was a life-changing thing. Similar to you, I loved all the people I worked with. I trusted the company. I became an evangelist for them. And I was midway through my second book when the whole thing imploded because of this kind of interim leader that the founders had stepped back. Tucker and Zach had left. And this guy, to put it lightly, just kind of did a bad job for a year and a half, like a really, really bad job. And there's posts about it. And as you point out, I got real deep on it on James Altucher. We could talk about it if you want, but the upshot is like the company collapsed with no notice. And, was just a fan of the company, and I wanted it to continue to survive. I wanted to keep writing books and publishing in this way that I had. And I wanted the team to not be a total loss. I wanted the ideas of Scribe to live on. So I started making some phone calls and did what I could to try to get the company back on track. And I found a group called Enduring Ventures, these great guys who have a track record in publishing and in sort of distressed situations. And they're a long-term holding company, not a fund a fix and flip fund or a high leverage fund or anything like that. So they ended up starting a new company, essentially buying the IP, moving over the team. And I was like, great, cool, like job done. I'll go back to writing a book. They actually then called me and asked me to join as CEO. And as part of that, I invested in the company. And, this kind of gets to your point, is like, by that point in my career, I was a pretty unique kind of key, being like an author with a podcast, with some operating experience in startups, and having been like publicly associated with Scribe before, and having worked with the team and having a relationship with them. And here comes Scribe, which is this like very unique lock, which is like kind of a startup, but kind of an operating business. And it needs somebody who has an operating background, but is also like confident in the world of creators and can work with creators. I think authors a lot of times need to hear from other authors. Like I did this in my first book. I reached out to a lot of people. I had a lot of conversations and just got some reassurance and some leadership, frankly, from people that have been down the path. And now I get to kind of do that at a more scaled way through Scribe and through the rest of the team. And that's fantastic. But I think that's kind of what the situation called for. And there's, that wasn't a super long list of people. I'm sure there's people out there that could also do the job and maybe even do it better. But I just happened to be the one who was probably closest at the time that they needed me.
Yeah. You don't know, right? Like that's the whole thing in this game is you don't know. Like you said, like your 22-year-old self, you're like, wait, what? What are we doing now?
There's no grand plan. I'm just taking the opportunity in front of me.
Yeah. But action, right? Like action's the plan, I would assume, right? Like just do something, right? Don't just sit around.
Yeah. Yeah. Even if you don't necessarily know where each thing is going to lead, right? Like I didn't know what was going to come of Twitter. I didn't know what was going to come of my blog. I didn't know what was going to come of writing the book. I still don't know what's going to come of, running this company for a while. So I stay moving and, new opportunities arise. And I like David Senner has a great line, opportunity well handled leads to other opportunity. And so I think to some extent, you want to always have something on your desk that you're doing a good job with. And, people will notice that and give you more opportunities.
Do you have this issue of you have talent, you have wisdom, you have thoughts, you have projects, you have books, like you could go and do a million different things right now. You're on a podcast and you're going to stop this and maybe you have a schedule, right? And it's very set and you can stick to that schedule. And I don't know where you are in the big 5 personality traits and all that kind of stuff, but like, do you have this issue like, wow, I could go in so many different directions right now. What am I going to do? Right. Or whatever that might look like. That's tough, right? Especially for a creative and, things like that.
Yeah, I'm terrible at it, frankly.
Yeah.
In the number of opportunities that I have at any given point, it only ever goes up, right? At least ideally, it only ever goes up. There's a lot of different ways to frame this, but Naval has given us some good pointers on this. And he's like, I ignore. There's things sitting in my inbox that I've ignored for a month that opportunities I would have killed for 10 years ago. And that's the way it goes, right? Like your opportunity cost is constantly raising and it's painful to go through those adjustments, but it's also kind of the nature of it. I tried to write a book or write a blog post about this. I think it's called like The Nature of Opportunity Cost, just about like transitioning through different phases of like readjusting your sensitivity to like what is and is not a good opportunity and when you should very deliberately level that up and change your attention threshold really is like how I think about it.
Yeah. My business partner talk a lot about trading up, right? Like it's inevitable, but I think it's like, that's why we read, that's why we listen to hear this wisdom because there is no right answer for it. But like, that's given me the conviction, the audacity to just like, keep going, right? Keep doing this thing or it's okay to ignore it. It's okay to not be, it's okay to screw that up, right? All that kind of stuff. You have to show up though with energy, I think. And like, clearly you have that. I mean, just to spend this time, it's tiring, right? To have a conversation, whether it's being recorded or not, then you throw the recording devices on and you're like, okay, I got to show up as my best self, at least try to. And it's tiring, right? And that it's like drains you. I heard someone talk about if you start off with 100 marbles in a day and you start taking some marbles away, like eventually you get taxed a little bit and then you're kind of done or whatever. And how do you refuel or whatnot? But for energy for you, like it seems to me, I don't know if you work from home or if you have a place that you go for work, that's a massive conversation right now. We talked a little bit about office space before, what Scribe Media does, but like for you, Eric, like what does that look like? Where do you work from? Do you go into an office ever? Like the whole work from home, return to office, like all of that.
Yeah, I work from home for the most part and I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah.
I think it suits me well. To your point, I try to kind of ride the energy when you have it. And that really allows you to like always push when you've got something left to give. There's downsides for that for sure. And I'm not an expert in these strategies, but I think managing energy is really, really important. And actually, like we just published a book. So this Leading to Thrive is an amazing book. And Klaus Kleinfeld is like one of these great guys who I mentioned, who's like, most people had not heard of him until we published this book about a month ago. But he's been the CEO of 2 different Fortune 500 companies. And he was like not born into a situation where that was a given at all. Like he, lost his father young, like immigrated to America. Like it is he really built himself into the person who could kind of step into roles like that. And the whole first half of the book is about the inner game. And it's about how to give yourself energy, how to cultivate energy, how to understand like all the way from physical health and exercise, and that actually like creates energy, not drains it, like manufactures it for you, how you time out your days and your routines, your mental and spiritual relationship to your work actually can give you more energy or drain it away from you. Like the story that you tell yourself about your work changes the amount of work that you can do, which I think is just so interesting. So there's no better like practitioner of that than somebody who's operating at that level in some of the most elite rooms in the world. And, he's a very practical, tactical guide to managing energy. So much more important than managing time or schedule or anything else.
For sure. For sure. So your team then, where does your team work from? Where does Scribe Media work?
We almost all work from home. There's a few, there's still kind of a center of gravity in Austin, Texas, but we're largely a remote company. And we sort of went through that transition during COVID, but that it has stuck. And as we've hired, we've kept that policy. So yeah, it gives us flexibility geographically, and we find talent, all over the place. And I think there's advantages there. There's some downsides to it and some hard things about remote work, but
Right. So you're in different cities then.
oh, we're in different states. Yeah, we're in California, Colorado, Texas, Michigan.
And you're in Missouri, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're in Missouri. And so then are you getting together like with the team? Like you have an office, I guess you said in Austin, maybe?
Yep.
Like, okay.
Yeah, different teams get together for different reasons, kind of on different cadences. But yeah, it's a very I've worked in cultures that sort of straddled that fence, and that was tough. I think you just need to pick a side. And if you go all remote, there's just a bunch of advantages to being all remote. And if you're all in person, there's a bunch of advantages to being all in person. The cultures that I've seen struggle are the kind of hybrid ones. But, it's not to say that can't be done well, but I don't have a strong opinion on it.
You don't have a strong opinion on one way or the other, like like the Amazon, like everyone coming back or like, let's do, yeah.
I think both can work. I think both can
It
work.
can all work. Yeah. Yeah. I get it. It's a big topic right now, right? And you hear in a lot of different companies talk about it, and a lot of operators are struggling with like, what decision do I make and all that. And I think, like you said before, I heard it was on the Moonshots podcast, and they're building massive. I think it's a Sandbox, it's called, and they're like, hey, we're going to build this out. We need the top talent. If you live in New Jersey, and I get it, you want to stay in New Jersey, you don't want to move to Austin, Texas, or California. Like, I get it, but let's do this anyway. And you stay in New Jersey, and we'll stay here, and then we'll hire someone in New Zealand or what have you, right? So I think it's all of the above.
I do think that's more realistic for software companies. Like, I think remote work and software, or remote work and just like digital products, can work a lot better. Like, it's no surprise to me that Elon Musk is like, everybody get your ass into the factory at Tesla. Like of course.
Yeah.
You just got to know your company, know your culture, know your people.
Yeah, that makes sense. College, you made a post about this recently. There's something that came about Harvard, and Harvard MBAs aren't this or that. So I was like, well, where did Eric go to school? He went to Michigan State, right? Sparty, right? The whole thing.
Yeah.
You can come from anywhere. Like, what are you thinking in regards to college right now? Like, you make that post, like, what's on your mind when it comes to that? It's a big topic.
Yeah. And I'm kind of in the perfect mode of ignorance right now, in that I'm 15 years out of college, and it's not like I have kids approaching college or anything. So I don't have to have a strong opinion. I have no skin in the game at the moment.
Sure.
I think from my view, college has gotten to be a very it's conflating a lot of different things, right? Like, there's still kind of research universities, and kind of just big tax advantage hedge funds, and kind of like this big dating pool, and kind of this credentialing machine, and a really important educational trade school. And everybody sort of sees different things in it. And there's such a wide range of colleges now, and degrees, and all of this thing, and the incentives that happen when the government subsidizes student loans. It is a very complicated mess. I have no perfect solutions, but I do think it's not. I think the attitudes towards it are changing slowly, and that's probably good, and that amazing alternatives are going to come out, like what Austin Allred has done with Lambda School, now Bloom Tech, and now his new company, I think Gauntlet AI, just kind of separating out the trade school aspects. I think there's amazing. I think education, and especially traditional college education, is extremely important, but I think it's being sort of diluted in very interesting ways that are not good for the long run. And the quality of the educations, I think, in general, are probably decreasing as the number of universities go up. And there's a lot of money being made for slightly dubious reasons. And everybody feels like they have to go, but is not entirely always sure why. And it's a
lot. It's complicated. It's not. You can't have an easy answer, and I think it's going to be specific to an individual. There's probably, I would imagine you would say, for the individual that is going to college, to take agency, right? You end up at Michigan State, you end up at whatever state, right? Or even a small private school. It's what you do with that, right? That's the very basic thing, because you can be taken advantage of at college. You could spend a lot of money and get nothing from it, or you could take advantage of being around a lot of like-minded people that are trying to make things happen at that time and go break some stuff while you're there.
Yeah, and I think the number of things I learned in my first year in the real workforce that would have changed how I approached college was massive. That experience just made me a big proponent of the gap year, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think changes kind of how you approach it and the decisions you made. In general, I think try to learn something that's really hard to learn outside of college. Math, engineering, tough to DIY. that kind of education. Really easy to read a lot of business books. Like economics is a little harder to learn outside than inside. But I think classical liberal arts, like the great books program, or like a true deep study of history is actually like, or philosophy is actually like a really powerful thing. But I think there are social sciences that you can get through on a bunch of like multiple choice tests that would be an absolute waste of time and money and get you nothing. So I think there's a lot of conflated things, and just like think hard about what you're getting and what you want to exit college a different person than you went into it. And you've got to put yourself through some hard shit to be sure you do that.
Yeah. What you just said right there is great. I love that. And I think AI will have a lot to say about what education looks like.
Yeah. The tutoring, like homeschool AI tutor use, just saw a study, I think last week, that's like now outperforming in, I think, 8 weeks, delivering the results of 2 years of a traditional schooling environment, which is absolutely wild. I think really interesting models of education are going to change. And there's so many powerful tools for learning. And there's a great Navalism about this. Like the tools of learning are abundant. The desire to learn is scarce. It was true with YouTube, but it's even more true now with AI. Anybody who wants to learn anything can learn anything. But most people don't have the sense of the ROI or the discipline to get through it. But you see people go monk mode and just go really hard on teaching themselves to learn to code, or, learning math or learning engineering, learning CAD, anything. You come out in 12 years or 12 months of hard work with an employable skill set very quickly.
Well, it's talked about like in The Sovereign Child, when he talks about the screen time, like you want to learn to play the guitar, you learn to go play the guitar. Just get on YouTube and get a guitar, buy, you could probably borrow one and then off you go, or whatever that thing is, or like some technical skill, you can do that. And I think there's been this huge lean into video thanks to YouTube and all these different platforms. And I think that's great, right? We could record this, we can publish it on there. And I think people like to see their faces, like who am I listening to and all that. And you guys talked about it on Ultra Show, right? Like he mentioned he reads less than he used to, he thinks. He's not sure, right? But there's obviously a lot of books being written. And you mentioned this on a different show. It's like books are always going to be here. I don't know where podcasts are going to go. I think podcasts will be here for a while. I think there's something to it.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe some aspect of it will change. And just like books became, you could read it on a device now. That you couldn't do that 50 years ago. So books will always be here. And it's a thing of like, how do you get more people to read? Like, I love what Naval said, like, read what you love until you love to read. Or like, even when I was reading The Sovereign Child, I used to say, you read the book and you got to finish the book. No, you don't, because he was like, well, just pick it up. I looked at the table of contents. I want to read this chapter right now. Why do I have to wait for it? So the relationship I had with books and this guilt that I had with books kind of went away. And that's just been like this another unlock for me. Then you throw an Audible, which is, it's not the same thing, but I love it, right? Like this, like I can consume more. I'm driving, I'm working out, but young people reading, or not even young people, I don't want to like say that, but like just in general, like reading, do you see that as well? I mean, you're obviously paying attention to what the consumer's doing. We're going to write all these books. Is anyone going to read it? Obviously they are, but like your thought on that.
Yeah, I think serious people will always read. I think like there's a lot of people that read as little as they can, and they will probably get the results they deserve. Acknowledging that reading is not easy for everybody, and there's dyslexic people, and some people are, better listeners than readers. But I think the returns to reading are quite high, in that they train your concentration and critical thinking in ways that just listening to audiobooks don't. I'm a fan of audiobooks. I listen to fiction on Audible, or I just get reps of material that I've already read and reminders. But your attention does not power an audiobook in the way that it powers a real book. And I think that's an important part of engaging with the material and understanding it. If you could give people one habit that would make them, one of a handful of habits that would make them significantly more likely to rise in life. And I learned this from Charlie Munger relatively young, like just read.
Yeah.
Just keep reading.
Yeah. Yeah. That, what you said, serious people always read. Like that's a line. You put that out there, and like, that's kind of like it's honest, and it's a call out, and it's a whatever. And maybe it's like you tell yourself that, right? Like, what am I doing? Like, just go read. Like, because even if that's the only thing you did, and you say, well, you should go to the gym. Yeah, but then you could read books about going to the gym or what fitness would look like. And that will help you unlock that aspect of it too. So it's like the ultimate thing that leads to the next thing.
Yeah. I mean, in Charlie Munger, like I sometimes fall into the story of telling myself that if I can work, I should work. And producing something is always better than just reading, just consuming something. And, Charlie Munger's like, I'm never wasting time if I have a book in my hands. And, another is like, if you look at some of the most successful people and you just watched what they did all day, it would probably be like a huge amount of their time would just be reading. And making space for that when there's a lot going on and we have a full inbox and still taking the time to read or work out. I kind of think they're the same sort of fundamental habits that you need.
Yeah. Yeah. It changes everything. It's 100%. I totally agree with it. Real quick, I want to hit you with this because you started talking about it before. Someone's going to write a book, right? They're coming to Scribe. Like, what books do you think would do well right now? Like, you talked about a financial advisor. You gave an example before, and it was really good because it's like there's so many financial books that are out there. Like, just go read a Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger type of book or some aspect of that. But then, like, you can get into that niche. Is there anything that you're thinking, like, man, this would do? It's not to say what would do well and sell a lot of books, because I think that's like we talked about before. But like, what do we need more books on? Because there's a lot of self-help books out there. Like, but what books are we craving right now from, like, maybe the person that's not the bestseller under whatever category that might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is backwards, like a backwards way to think about it. Like, I don't think about creating books in terms of like, is there an existing market for it? Is it time for it? Any of that. I think about it, usually you start with the author, you start with their expertise and their experience, and you want to package that effectively in a targeted way to drive the results that the author is looking for. That's how I approach it and how I recommend individuals approach it. And you'll be surprised sometimes who you reach if you reach that initial target audience of 20,000 or 50,000 people, but that's who you want to write something for very explicitly from the beginning. So I think the right conversation always starts with the author and their unique gifts, their experience. I will answer your question though in slightly different ways, that I think we need a lot more utopian science fiction. I think there's a lot of dystopian fiction, and I think to some extent, like, the car goes where you drive it as a civilization. So I would love to see a lot more sunny, like, positive, like, interesting interpretation. I think we can't possibly have enough science fiction. And so I was encouraged, like, that is a very high leverage way to change how people think about the future and what they work on and what they think is important. And there's always an appetite for a good story.
I love that. Yeah. My dad actually, he self-published with us a book, and it went down that path of science fiction. And I think maybe in this utopian society, right, like, you're still gonna have struggles along the way, right? It's gonna be up and down. Like,
Sure, yeah.
that's a true story. But like, to have that, and his second book was actually titled Reach for the Stars. And there's like a lot of positivity, which matches who he is. And he's working on his third book right now. His fourth book, in my opinion, should be his story, right? His background and what he did and all that. So that'd be an awesome conversation to have with Scribe Media as well. I think that would play out really well. So
Cool.
Eric, man, this has been a privilege. I could go on with more topics, and I'm sure you'll come out with more books. You have other books as well. We'll put the links to all those books that you have. If you come out with another one, please, let's talk again, and I'll talk anytime. But I don't know if there's anything else that we missed or we need to talk about, but I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I'm hard at work on another book now, so maybe I'll be back before too long.
Do we have a name of that book, or we can't share that one just yet?
The Book of Elon Musk.
Oh, there we go. Okay, it'll do well. So Scribe Media and you, where do we connect? Where do we learn more about what you guys are all up to?
Yeah, scribemedia.com. We help entrepreneurs, executives, coaches, speakers, whatever, write, publish, and market their book. If you want help writing it, we can help you write it. If you have already written it and you just want help publishing it, we can help you publish it. And all of my personal stuff, my newsletter, my podcast, all that is at ejorgenson.com.
Yeah. And I think it's really cool too, because like, you're talking about the books. You brought the book on here. This isn't your book. Obviously, you're a part of it. You're the CEO of the company, but you have the author's backs. You have their back from the beginning of that conversation, like you said, of like, hey, this is an interesting individual. You have stories. I have no idea what your stories are, but let's talk about it and let's unpack it and let's put something together. And I think that's like, you're giving people this, like, I talked to an artist recently and she just wants to help other people paint. Right. And maybe you sell it. Maybe you go in galleries, or maybe you create a workshop, or whatever that is. I just want you to be creative. And she's doing that. And she's giving them the freedom to say, you can do this. Because she was told a long time ago, and the artist said, just paint. She's like, well, I just can't do it. He's like, what do I do? He's like, go buy paintbrushes, right? And then just paint. And I think that's something awesome. And you're doing the same thing with just write, right? Just write. Or if you have a podcast, just turn on the mic and like have a conversation with somebody. And we need more of that. And that's the utopian side of things, to say it's just, I don't know, being creative and having these conversations. It's tiring, but it also gives you a ton of energy as well.
And everybody has something to teach. Like, everybody has something to teach. And we all benefit from everything that the past generations shared with us, whether they wrote it down or recorded it or just taught us person to person. And so I'm a huge believer in trying to remove the friction. And, our mission is to unlock the world's wisdom. And so it's hard to write a book. It takes hundreds of hours. It takes expertise. It takes courage. It takes the emotional journey. But we can make that a lot easier for people by interviewing them and writing as they're talking and extract their wisdom for them. And we are experts in the craft of writing and packaging and publishing the book, and we'll help you ensure that it happens at a really high quality level and let you, give back to your industry, your community, your family, your hold your legacy, hold your space without, needing to spend 2 years with a typewriter in a cabin in the woods.
Right. Well, I've seen it. I've seen it from authors that Scribe Media's worked from before and today, whether it's the books, whether it's the authors we've talked to, now obviously talking to you, talking to your team. Yeah, I vouch for it as well. So, man, I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, man. Appreciate it. It means a lot.
This is a Quiet Loud Studios production, the podcast network where reflection meets amplification.